My dad crushes my dreams to protect Golden Child and refuses to pay for my tuition. I get my sweet revenge. I have a younger brother, 28, and we were raised by our dad, 56. Ever since we were in middle school, my dad has always favored my brother over me. I was never the kind of son that my dad wanted because I had no interest in sports or doing the typical macho stuff that boys were never my thing. I was always more into traditionally feminine things, which is why I was a huge mama's boy growing up. I loved everything to do with the kitchen, reading books, and even singing. My dad tried to make me play football with him, but I was no good at it. Gradually, we grew apart. My brother, on the other hand, was exactly the kind of son that my father wanted. He was a rough and tough boy, not afraid of getting dirty or even getting hurt. He was the perfect son. My dad loved my brother more than he loved me. He'd always have great things to say about my brother, but never me. My mother was fair to both of us, but she never played favorites. I loved her more than my dad, too. I tried to befriend my dad and spend time with him, but once we grew apart, he didn't seem too keen on fixing our relationship. Unfortunately, the glue holding our messed up family. My mother passed away when I was in 8th grade. She'd been suffering from cancer, and by the time we realized it, it was too late for her to be saved. She was gone before we knew it. My mother's passing pretty much devastated me. I kind of spiraled during that time. My only solace was the kitchen. I'd whip up something new every day as if my life depended on it. My mother was a great cook. She often told me that had she not been forced into taking over her dad's business, she probably would have become a chef. Cooking was the only thing that brought me any comfort. My dad and brother were no help in dealing with my feelings. They suppressed any emotional reaction they'd had to my mother's passing. In normal families, something like this would have brought us closer. My dad was even more pissed off at my fixation on cooking. He kept bugging me to get out of the kitchen and do something more manly. One day he'd had enough. He told me that if he saw me in the kitchen again, he'd make me do all the other household chores as well. He told me to be more like my brother and man up. This led to a huge fight where I told him he never loved me. I guess it was pretty much out in the open. One day, he finally had enough and told me to get out of the kitchen and do something more manly. He even threatened that if he saw me in the kitchen again, he'd make me do all the other household chores as well. He told me to be more like my brother and man up. This led to a huge fight where I told him he never loved me and he agreed. It was finally out in the open, and I guess it was pretty much on the last day that my father and I spoke to each other so openly I stopped trying to win him over altogether. He didn't seem to care about it either. For the next few years, I spent all the time I had in my room listening to music and studying new recipes. I was determined to make this whole chef thing work out, not just for myself but also for my mother. Meanwhile, my dad and I only spoke when it was absolutely necessary. My brother didn't care about me much either. My mom passed away and I was left with no one I could count on. I had to take matters into my own hands. I applied to a few of the top culinary schools as well as normal colleges. I didn't know if my dad would agree to it, but I had to try. I'd already interned at a restaurant that summer and had some experience. I made them write a recommendation letter for me, which helped me get accepted into several of the schools I applied to, including one of the best, which just so happened to be in France. I was thrilled that this was finally happening for me, but I was equally nervous because I knew I'd have to ask my dad for permission. I'd already made up my mind to beg him to let me go if he seemed reluctant because I absolutely had to make this happen. I wasn't going to let anything get in my way. I told my father about my plans eventually. I was ready for him to say it wasn't a masculine profession and that I should forget about it. But I wasn't prepared for him to say he wouldn't pay my tuition. I was confused. My dad isn't poor. My father was well off and could easily afford to send me to France. Money wasn't the reason he wouldn't pay for my tuition. It was because if I went to France and joined such a reputable school, it would make my younger brother feel insecure. He was struggling with his grades and couldn't focus. My dad wanted me to either go to community college or find a way to pay for my own tuition. I was astonished. I was infuriated that he would do something so cruel to his own son, and didn't know what to say to him. I told him that I needed this, but he was hellbent and was absolutely unwilling to pay for my tuition. He even told me that my brother's well-being was his topmost priority, and that he doesn't want me competing with his son. I was incredulous that this was happening, because I couldn't even imagine any other father in the world crushing their child's dreams like this. I was crushed. My father was crushing my dreams just to favor his favorite. I pleaded and sobbed, but he refused to budge. I got into a huge fight with him and left his house for good. I started living with my maternal aunt, my mother's older sister. I hadn't moved out earlier because I found comfort in the house where I grew up with my mom. I told her I didn't want to change schools, which I'd have to do if I moved in with my aunt since she lived pretty far away from the high school I went to. I explained that my dad had refused to pay my tuition, and that I needed her help. I didn't ask for a ton of money since she wasn't as rich as my dad, but she reassured me that she'd take care of all my expenses somehow. She managed to get it done. All her friends pitched in, and I got to attend the culinary school of my dreams. I'll always be grateful for that. Once I got there, I worked part-time and made the most of my time there. I worked hard and made my way up. When I graduated, I was one of the most skilled chefs there. I even got a job just a few months after I graduated. I worked at a high-end French restaurant and sent half of my salary back to my aunt to repay whatever debt I had. I was just lucky that I didn't have to rely on a student loan. I worked in France for a few years before finally moving back home. Once I'd saved up enough to open my own restaurant, I did it. It's been a couple of years, and now in the meantime, I worked at another restaurant here as the head chef while also working towards my goal of opening up my own restaurant someday. I finalized everything a few weeks ago, and I was able to finally open up the restaurant I've been working towards for so long. Two of my friends from back when I was in France also joined in on my business idea and are co-owners with me, which is why I was grateful when they allowed me to choose what we were going to name the restaurant. We all hail from the same state, and we were all on board with opening our restaurant. My city of choice was ideal, and I chose to name it after my mother, which was a stroke of good fortune. My mother has a beautiful, uncommon name in our hometown, and it was all coming together. A few days ago, we threw a party for a few select guests before we officially opened our doors. I invited my aunt and a few of her friends, who I also pitched in to help pay for my tuition. I invited some of my friends back from school, but that was it. I didn't invite my father and brother because of obvious reasons. I could have invited them, but I hadn't spoken to them since I left home, and they hadn't bothered to get in touch. I guess we were better off this way, but I should have known they would show up. They wanted to piggyback on my success, and that's exactly what they did. They showed up an hour before the party was due to begin, but they weren't stopped by security since we shared the last name. They claimed that they were here to surprise me, and they were. I was definitely surprised when I saw them. My dad and brother greeted me like nothing awful had ever happened in the past, and were really warm towards me. This was probably the first time in my entire life that had happened. I was shocked to see them, so I just froze when they first entered the restaurant. My buddies noticed that something was off, and after politely greeting my family, they left us on our own. I'm thankful that they were able to pick up on my discomfort. I still hadn't recovered from the shock of seeing them again when they dropped another bomb on me, and showed me a gift they brought for me. A portrait of my mother and my dad. They even told me. He told me that he'd commissioned a portrait of my mother and father to hang in my restaurant. He said that he'd heard that a new restaurant with the same name was opening in our city, and that he'd known all along that it was his son. He even told me that he'd always known that I had it in me. My brother was also praising me and telling me that he was immensely proud of me. I was shocked, but I knew instantly that something was very strange about all of this. I didn't say much and kept waiting for them to get to the point because I knew there must have been a reason for them to be here. I let them speak and eventually they did get to the reason they were here. My brother was working as a bartender now, and that was possible just because my dad had managed to convince a friend of his to give him a job at his club. My brother's grades had kept falling. My brother didn't end up in the high-paying positions throughout high school and college. My dad had always expected more from him. He also slacked off during his high school football games, which is why he wasn't able to get a sports scholarship. He ended up having to go to community college because he got rejected everywhere else. They wanted me to make my brother a partner in the business. I had the urge to laugh in their face but somehow managed to hold back. Instead, I told them that I'd think about it. I wasn't going to think about it, though. I just didn't want to turn them away. I wanted them to stay for the party because I had a much better plan in mind to humiliate my family, who'd come out of the woodwork as soon as they received word of my success. As soon as they received word of my success, they seemed reasonably pleased. However, they had no idea what was about to come. After a while, our guests started arriving. In an hour or so, everyone we'd invited was there. I spent the evening socializing while my dad and brother also did the same. I even heard them boasting about me to a few people while I marveled at their sheer audacity. At the end of the party, it was time for the hosts to take the stage. It was time for me and my partners to give a toast. My friends went first since I wanted to save the best for last. Then it was my turn to speak. I was finally going to speak my mind. I started off by thanking all my guests and raised a drink to my mother first. She was the reason I'd even been able to achieve so much. I strongly believe that it was her faith in me as a child that had made me believe I could do it. I thanked her for everything she had done for me, and for teaching me to believe in myself. After paying my respects, I addressed the DI. I told them how I had had to take a loan from my aunt and her friends to go to culinary school. I thanked them, and then finally I got to the reason I had had to take a loan for my tuition in the first place: my family. I told them how I had grown up with my father never loved or had faith in me. He always berated me for having feminine interests like cooking. My younger brother was the spitting image of my dad. I told them all about how my dad refused to pay for my tuition. He was afraid that I would become more successful than my younger brother, who was his golden child. That's why I left home. Despite all odds, I rose and became who I am today. They did deserve some credit for creating all the hardships I've had to face. Otherwise, I never would have found out how resilient I was. Many people shot my dad and brother the nastiest looks they could manage while I was saying all of this. They even had the good sense to at least look ashamed. I knew that they didn't feel that way in the slightest. I then walked over to my dad and brother and actually hugged them. I had a good laugh at their expense. I told them that because they'd shown up to celebrate my success today, I'd forgiven them for whatever had happened in the past, and was even ready to give my brother the job of bartender at my restaurant to other people. This was obviously a really emotional reconciliation for them. They ended up actually clapping for me at the end of my speech, and there were a few wolf whistles too. My family and I knew this was nothing more than an attempt to humiliate them, which I'd done quite successfully. They had to smile and act grateful, though they couldn't storm out angrily. When the crowd cleared and it was time for us to leave, my dad and brother confronted me outside my restaurant. They were furious. My brother was angry. He demanded an explanation for what I'd done. He wanted to know if I'd never intended on making my brother a partner. He said I should have just turned them away as soon as they arrived. I just laughed and told them that this was my form of paying them back for everything that they'd done for me over the years. This is exactly what they deserved. Then I walked away and didn't bother to look back. Even when I heard my brother was crying about how this was the cruelest thing and even yelled after me to tell me that I'd regret this, but I didn't care since I was already in my car and was driving away. This happened a couple of days ago, and I haven't heard from them since. My aunt thinks that I might have gone a little too far with this one and should have just kicked them out at first, but I don't agree with her. This was well deserved. Update 1. I decided not to reach out to my family to apologize, despite what my aunt said about me being too harsh. I don't feel sorry about what I did, so I'm not going to pretend I do, and go out of my way to say so. They could have taken the opportunity to apologize to me when they visited me, but they didn't. I explained this to my aunt as well, and while my aunt still believes I shouldn't have done what I did, but she hasn't said much about it. I guess this is just one of those areas where we agree to disagree, and I'm okay with that. In other news, my brother has made sure that he goes behind my back to talk crap about me to all our friends back from school. It's unfortunate that we went to the same high school, since this just means that random strangers from school are now texting to confirm the rumors that I humiliated and kicked out my dad and brother from my restaurant after feeding them 3-day-old food on purpose. He exaggerated the story to make himself seem like the victim, which is pretty unsurprising. I wouldn't care about petty rumors ordinarily, but I don't want potential customers taking these rumors seriously. I've texted my brother that if he doesn't stop spreading lies about me in my restaurant, I'll make sure that he'll lose the job he has right now. I'm hoping that it works because I really don't feel like dealing with their unnecessary crap right now. I'm really busy with work, and this just isn't the time. I'll give him an update. My brother texted back saying that he was going to stop only when I'd make him a partner. I don't even understand what level of idiocy and delusion this is. Besides, if he wants to be a partner, then it's a stupid idea for him to be talking crap about the same restaurant. I'm pretty sure this is my dad's tactic to ensure his darling son lands a high-profile job without doing any real work. It's not going to work with me. I've told him that if he doesn't stop, he'll be hearing from my lawyers. He's in absolutely no position to be negotiating with me right now. I haven't done anything yet, because I don't want to get caught up in unnecessary drama. But I'll mess him up if he tries anything funny after this. This is my last warning. I really hope he takes it to heart. It's been about a month since the last update. I've been busy, so I haven't been able to fill you in on what happened after that. My brother did stop talking crap about me behind my back, but they were still pretty desperate to join in on my success. So my dad decided to pay me a visit with my brother a few weeks ago. They showed up at my house threatening to sue me for using my mother's name for my restaurant. They even told me that they'd already spoken to a lawyer. They said that if I didn't want any trouble, I needed to make my brother a partner as soon as possible. I called their bluff immediately. No lawyer would take up such a stupid case. They were forgetting a very important fact. She was my mother too, not just his wife. As far as I was concerned, no law could stop me from using her name. By then I'd had enough of their bullcrap. I told them that if they didn't leave me alone, they'd be forcing my hand. I'd have no option but to. I told them to call the cops. My brother lost his temper and tried to grab me by the collar, but my dad held him back. I think the constant humiliation had finally gotten to him and he'd snapped. It wasn't my fault, and they were lucky that I didn't call the cops right then. I told my dad that he needed to get the hell out, but he only told my brother to go cool off in the car. After my brother left, he tried to manipulate me by saying that if my mother found out what I was doing, she'd be upset. He told me to bury the hatchet. I told him to leave me alone because I was at my limit. He couldn't use my mother to get his way. That was a low move. To be honest, we were way past the point of reconciliation. Neither of them had apologized to me even once, so I really didn't understand why they expected me to forgive them without even asking for it. As for what my mother would feel, I'm sure she would have felt equally let down back when my father had refused to pay for my tuition. And for that matter, he made me feel awful about myself every single time. So he should be the last person to give me a sermon about what my mother would and wouldn't like. I know she's proud of me wherever she is, and nothing my dad says is going to change that. At least my restaurant is doing well, and we'll be able to expand soon enough.